I shall tell you a story from my youth, a tale so stained with tragedy and moral ambiguity that it has been largely forgotten by the proud families of this state, who prefer their histories clean and their consciences untroubled. It is an account I heard from the lips of one who was there, in the waning days of what some still call the Old South, a world now as distant and strange as Babylon. This story concerns the Whitney family, or what was left of it, and their estate, Briarwood, a place of fading grandeur slowly being reclaimed by the cypress swamps of South Carolina. It was the year of our Lord 1853, a time when the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and impending ruin, though few cared to acknowledge the latter. It is a cautionary tale about the limits of charity, the corruption of possession, and the terrifying price of misunderstanding a human soul. Listen, then, to the strange and sorrowful history of the Alabaster Man. The air in the open-air exchange on Chalmers Street was a thick, foul soup of humidity, unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and a palpable, sickening anxiety. It was a bright, cruel day in the spring of 1853, and the sun beat down upon the scene with an indifferent glare. Gentlemen in linen suits and planters' hats fanned themselves with folded newspapers, their faces florid and complacent. Ladies, sheltered under parasols, averted their eyes from the more vulgar proceedings, though their ears were keenly attuned to the auctioneer's rapid-fire chant. The true focus of the day, however, was the series of raised wooden platforms upon which human merchandise was displayed, examined, and sold. It was here that Mrs. Eleanor Whitney found herself, a solitary figure in deep mourning black, her attire a stark contrast to the gaudy silks and light muslins of the other women. A widow at 28, she possessed a quiet, melancholic beauty, with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold a permanent sorrow, and pale skin untouched by the southern sun. Her husband, Arthur Whitney, had been carried off by a fever 2 winters prior, leaving her the sole mistress of Briarwood, a rice plantation slowly sinking into debt and isolation. She was not here to acquire field hands. The overseer managed such coarse acquisitions. She had come to Charleston seeking a house servant, someone refined and quiet to attend to her in the lonely vastness of her home. The auctioneer, a man named Rigby with a voice like gravel and a smile that never reached his eyes, worked his way through the lots. Strong-backed men from the Guinea coast, their faces masks of stoic resignation, women with infants clinging to their skirts, their fate a terrifying uncertainty, skilled craftsmen, carpenters and blacksmiths, who commanded higher prices. Eleanor watched it all with a growing sense of discomfort, a feeling she diligently suppressed as a sign of weak-mindedness. This was simply the way of the world, the foundation upon which her life, and the life of everyone she knew, was built. Then, as the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to grow restless, Rigby's tone changed. It became theatrical, conspiratorial. "And now, gentlemen and ladies," he added with a nod toward Eleanor's section, "a lot of particular interest. A rarity. A genuine novelty." He gestured, and 2 burly attendants dragged a young man onto the platform. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The slave was perhaps 18 years of age, tall and painfully thin, his frame speaking of prolonged neglect. But it was his appearance that caused the stir. His skin was not black, nor brown, nor the light tan of a mulatto. It was the color of white chalk, of bleached bone, startlingly pale and almost luminous in the harsh sunlight. His hair, cropped short, was the shade of raw cotton or spun milk, and it framed a face of sharp, almost delicate features. Most unnerving of all were his eyes, wide, intelligent, and the color of the palest rose quartz, pupils a startling blood red. They did not look down in submission but swept over the crowd with a raw, undiluted hatred that was more unsettling than any cry of despair. He was an albino. A strong lad, despite his looks. Rigby boomed, undeterred by the crowd's murmuring. "Sound of limb. Acquired from an estate up near Georgetown. Ideal for indoor service, as you can well imagine. Sensitive to the light, but a quick learner. We start the bidding at $100. The crowd was hesitant. Superstition ran deep in the Lowcountry. Some saw his condition as a mark of God's disfavor, a curse. Others whispered of ghosts and haints, believing his kind to be connected to the spirit world. To own such a person was to invite bad luck into your home. Eleanor Whitney, however, felt a different emotion rise within her, a complex, swirling mixture of profound pity and a sudden, intense fascination. She saw not a cursed being, but a creature of exquisite and terrible uniqueness, a soul trapped in a body that made him a pariah among pariahs. Here was someone even more isolated than she. The Christian duty of charity, a concept she had clung to in her grief, merged with a more possessive, aesthetic impulse. To rescue this singular young man, to bring him into her home and show him kindness, would be a testament to her own goodness, a good work that might fill the echoing silence of Briarwood. The bidding was sluggish. A riverboat captain, intrigued by the novelty, bid $150. A tavern owner, thinking to use him as a draw, offered $175. $200, Eleanor said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. All eyes turned to the widow in black. Rigby's eyebrows shot up. $200 from the lady. Do I hear $220? The captain shook his head. The tavern owner shrugged. The risk was too great. Sold. To the lady for $200. Rigby declared, bringing his gavel down with a definitive crack. As the paperwork was drawn up, Rigby leaned closer to Eleanor, his breath smelling of whiskey. A word of caution. The previous owner called him Ghost. He's a quiet one, doesn't speak much. But there's a temper in him, I'm told. You do well to be firm. Eleanor nodded, barely hearing him. She had secured her prize. She approached the platform, looking up at the young man who was now, by law, her property. He stared down at her, his pink eyes burning with an intelligence and a hostility that should have frozen the blood in her veins. But Eleanor, wrapped in the certainty of her own benevolence, saw only a challenge to be met, a soul to be saved. Come, she said, her voice gentle. Your name is Casper now. You are coming home with me to Briarwood. The transaction, a brisk and impersonal affair of inked signatures and exchanged banknotes, stood in stark contrast to the profound and unsettling human reality it represented. As the documents were finalized, the two attendants made to lead the albino youth, now named Casper, from the platform. He shrugged off their rough hands with a sharp, fluid motion that spoke of a deep-seated pride, or perhaps a feral refusal to be handled. He stepped down of his own accord, his movements unnervingly silent, and stood before his new owner. Up close, the strangeness of his appearance was even more pronounced. The paleness of his skin was not that of a Caucasian, but something altogether otherworldly, like marble or fine porcelain, and it was traced with a delicate web of blue veins at his temples and wrists. The scars the auctioneer had mentioned were visible now, a old, silvery welt across his back, visible through the thin, torn fabric of his shirt, and a newer, pinker mark on his jawline. His lot of particular interest was not just his pigmentation, but the story of hardship etched upon his body. Eleanor, for her part, felt a flutter of nervousness beneath her resolve. The young man's silence was not the passive quiet of submission, but a dense, heavy thing, a wall he had built around himself. His rose-colored eyes, devoid of any softening lens, fixed on her with an unnerving directness. They did not plead, nor did they thank. They simply assessed, judged, and found wanting. This way, she said, her voice softer than she intended, gesturing towards her waiting carriage, a modest but well-kept brougham. The driver, an older black man named Joseph who had been with the Whitney family for decades, watched the proceedings with a face of carefully carved stone. His eyes met the albino's for a fleeting second, and in that glance passed a world of unspoken understanding and wary assessment. The journey to the livery stable where the carriage was housed was a short but tense walk through the crowded streets. Casper, walking a pace behind Eleanor as was expected, drew stares and whispers. Children pointed, their mouths agape. A well-dressed matron clutched her pearls and made a sign against the evil eye. A group of rough-looking sailors crossing the street fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats as they beheld the pale specter following the lady in black. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on some distant point ahead, his posture rigid. He was a man accustomed to being a spectacle, and his defense was a profound and isolating indifference. Once inside the enclosed carriage, The atmosphere grew even more stifling. The scent of Eleanor's lavender water mingled with the lingering, acrid smell of the auction yard that clung to Casper's clothes. She sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap, searching for something to say, some word of comfort or assurance that would break the ice. "The ride to Briarwood is several hours," she began, her words sounding terribly inadequate in the confined space. "It is a peaceful place. On the river. You will have light duties. Inside the house." Casper did not respond. He did not even look at her. Instead, he turned his head to watch the city pass by the small window, the dappled light playing over his alabaster features. The clatter of the wheels on the cobblestones seemed to be the only sound he acknowledged. Your previous owner," Eleanor ventured, against her better judgment. "He called you ghost?" At this, a muscle in his jaw tightened. It was the first voluntary reaction she had elicited from him. Still, he remained silent. "That is not a suitable name," Eleanor declared, a note of forced gentility entering her voice. "Casper is a good Christian name. It signifies a bearer of treasure." A faint, almost imperceptible sneer twisted his lips for a moment, then was gone. He continued to stare out the window as Charleston's grand houses and manicured squares gave way to the outskirts of the city, where shanties and warehouses stood sentinel along the muddy roads leading into the countryside. Eleanor leaned back against the velvet upholstery, a faint sigh escaping her. Her act of charity was proving to be a more complicated and less gratifying endeavor than she had imagined. The object of her benevolence was not a grateful, pliable creature, but a hard, closed fist of a human being. She had purchased a mystery, and the silence emanating from him felt increasingly like a challenge to the very foundations of her world. The carriage rolled on, leaving the city behind and carrying them both toward the isolated, waiting gloom of Briarwood. The rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels on the packed earth road settled into a monotonous drone, a sound that seemed to amplify rather than fill the silence between its two occupants. Eleanor Whitney watched the young man who now bore the name Casper. He had not moved since they left the city, his posture remaining as stiff and unyielding as a statue carved from salt. His gaze was fixed on the passing landscape, but she sensed he was not truly seeing the endless green walls of pine and live oak, the sudden, startling flashes of white egrets in the murky water of the roadside ditches, or the vast, aching blue of the southern sky. He was looking inward, or perhaps he was looking straight through the world, his strange eyes focused on some private horizon of misery or rage. She had intended this journey to be a time of gentle orientation, a chance to set the tone for their new relationship. She had envisioned herself as a benevolent teacher, soothing his fears and outlining the comfortable future that awaited him. But his impenetrable silence was a wall against which all her prepared words shattered. The charity she had so confidently bestowed in the auction house now felt like a weight in her own stomach. It required a recipient, some flicker of acknowledgement, to validate it. From him, she received nothing. Frustration began to prickle at the edges of her pity. Did he not understand the singular nature of her intervention? Other buyers would have worked him in the fields, exposed his sensitive skin to the brutal sun until it blistered and cracked. Others would have treated him as a freak, a circus exhibit to be jeered at. She had saved him from that. She was offering him sanctuary, a place of safety and relative comfort within the walls of her home. Was he too ignorant, too broken, to comprehend his own good fortune? She made another attempt, her voice carefully modulated to convey warmth. "The low country is beautiful, is it not? So different from the city. The air at Briarwood is clearer. You will be able to breathe there." No response. Not even a flicker of his eyes in her direction. A memory surfaced, unbidden, the auctioneer Rigby's warning. "There's a temper in him, I'm told." She dismissed it. What she was witnessing was not temper, but sullenness. It was the ingrained insolence of the poorly raised, a character flaw that her patience and kindness would, in time, correct. Her conviction in this was a necessary bulwark against the creeping unease. She had to believe that beneath this hard, white shell was a soul capable of being touched, of feeling gratitude. The alternative, that she had purchased a being fundamentally incapable of returning the affection she planned to lavish upon him, was too disquieting to entertain. She studied his profile. In the shifting light of the carriage, he was, in a stark and unsettling way, beautiful. Like something from a classical myth, a nymph cursed into a form of frozen moonlight. There was an intellectual quality to his high brow and sharp cheekbones that belied his status as mere property. This observation fueled her determination further. He was not just a slave, he was a project. A complex, fascinating project that would give purpose to her lonely days at Briarwood. She would civilize him, educate him, save his soul. His eventual transformation into a loyal, devoted servant would be a testament to her own virtue. The house is large, she continued, undeterred, and old. It was built by my husband's grandfather. There is a library. I believe everyone should be able to read the Word of God. Perhaps, in time, I could have you taught. This, finally, elicited a reaction. His head turned slowly, and those pink quartz eyes pinned her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a terrifying second, she saw the raw intelligence and seething emotion he had so successfully concealed. It was not the look of an ignorant brute. It was the look of a man who understood the power of words, the hypocrisy of offering the Bible to one who was denied the most basic freedoms it preached. The look was so full of scorching contempt that it felt like a physical blow. Then, just as quickly, he turned back to the window, the shutters coming down once more. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. A flush of humiliation heated her cheeks. He had not spoken a word, yet he had somehow rejected her, judged her, and found her wanting. Her charity had been exposed as the patronizing gesture it was, and he had thrown it back in her face without uttering a single syllable. The rest of the journey passed in a heavy, charged silence. The landscape grew wilder, the road narrower. The air, thick with the scent of pluff mud and decaying vegetation, began to carry the distinct, melancholic character of the salt marsh. They were entering the true lowcountry now, a world of water and sky, of hidden creeks and vast, silent expanses. Eleanor stared at the unyielding back of her new possession, her initial pity now alloyed with a resolve that was hardening into something colder, more determined. He would learn. He would see the goodness of her intentions. She would break this silence, no matter how long it took. The act of charity had been completed with the exchange of money, but the real work, the conquest of this alabaster man's spirit, had only just begun. And she was a Whitney of Briarwood. She was not accustomed to losing. The carriage, a dark, rolling island of tension, pressed onward, leaving the last vestiges of cultivated land behind. The world outside the windows underwent a profound transformation, as if they were traveling not merely south, but backward in time, into a primeval and brooding landscape. The neat rows of cotton and tobacco fields gave way to a vast, shimmering expanse of salt marsh, an endless sea of cordgrass that rippled like liquid gold in the afternoon sun. The air, once carrying the distant hum of the city, was now filled with a chorus of unseen life, the guttural croak of bullfrogs, the skittering of crabs in the pluff mud, the high, lonesome cry of a marsh hawk circling overhead. The scent was thick and complex, the fecund odor of decay, the briny tang of the tidal creeks, and the sweet, almost cloying perfume of Confederate jasmine that climbed the skeletal trunks of long-dead trees. This was the lowcountry in its raw, untamed state, a beautiful, treacherous world of water and sky, where the line between solid ground and sucking bog was often treacherously thin. The road, now little more than a ribbon of crushed oyster shells raised on a causeway, wound its way through this liquid landscape. From the carriage window, Eleanor could see the distant, hulking forms of live oaks, their branches bearded with long, ghostly trails of Spanish moss that stirred in the sluggish breeze like the tattered shrouds of forgotten souls. Casper remained a statue, his gaze seemingly locked on this strange new world. But Eleanor, watching him closely now, perceived a subtle shift. It was not acceptance, nor was it fear. It was a deep, resonant recognition. This landscape of shadows and hidden waters, of stark beauty and implicit danger, seemed to mirror something within him. The oppressive green gloom, the sudden, startling flashes of white egrets against the dark water, the sense of a world half-drowned and teeming with secret life. It was an environment as singular and isolated as he was. After what felt like an eternity, the carriage turned off the main causeway onto a narrower, more overgrown track. Ancient oaks formed a canopy so thick it plunged the path into a premature twilight. The air grew cooler, damp and heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Through the tangled undergrowth, Eleanor caught glimpses of a brick wall, crumbling in places, choked with ivy. "We are on Whitney land now," she said, her voice sounding small and fragile in the encompassing silence. She felt a familiar pang, the mixed pride and sorrow of returning to the place that held all her memories of Arthur and all the weight of her present solitude. The carriage emerged from the tunnel of trees into a large, neglected clearing. And there stood Briarwood. It was a tall, gaunt house of faded gray clapboard, built in the classic lowcountry style, raised on high brick pillars to escape floodwaters and catch the summer breezes. A wide two-story porch, or piazza, wrapped around its front and sides, but several of its white columns were warped, and the paint was peeling like sunburnt skin. The windows on the upper floor were dark and shuttered, like closed eyes. The entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of the humidity and its own history, leaning into the embrace of massive, gnarled wisteria vines that threatened to pull the whole edifice down into the earth. To the rear, through a break in the trees, the glint of a slow-moving, tea-colored river could be seen. The only signs of life were a few listless chickens pecking in the dirt and a plume of smoke rising from a separate, smaller building, the kitchen house. The carriage came to a halt. Joseph, the driver, climbed down and opened the door. Eleanor alighted, her legs stiff, and turned to face Casper. He descended slowly, his movements still unervingly silent. He stood on the crushed-shell drive, his alabaster skin stark and unnatural against the deep greens and browns of the surrounding wilderness. He lifted his head, his pink eyes scanning the face of the house, the overgrown gardens, the dense wall of the swamp beyond. For the first time, Eleanor saw something other than hatred or indifference in his expression. It was assessment, a cold, calculating taking of stock. "This is Briarwood," Eleanor said, her voice regaining some of its authority now that she was on her own ground. "This is your home now." The word home hung in the thick, moist air, a grotesque misnomer. This was a place of exile for both of them, for vastly different reasons. For her, it was a gilded cage of memory and loneliness. For him, it was simply another cage, albeit one with a more comfortable perch. The front door of the house opened, and an older black woman emerged, wiping her hands on a white apron. This was Malma Bess, the cook and the de facto manager of the household in the absence of a male master. Her face, a roadmap of wrinkles and quiet strength, was impassive as she took in the scene, her mistress, and the spectral figure standing beside her. Her eyes met Casper's for a long, unflinching moment. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a deep, weary understanding, and a flicker of something that might have been pity or warning. "Malma Bess," Eleanor said, her tone brightening with forced cheer. "This is Casper. He will be helping in the house. Please see that he is settled in the attic room and given something suitable to wear." Bess nodded slowly, her eyes still on the albino. "Yes'm," she said, her voice a low rumble. "Come on then." Casper's gaze swept one last time over the decaying house, the encroaching swamp, the silent, watching woman. Then, without a glance at Eleanor, he turned and followed Bess into the dark mouth of Briarwood, his pale form being swallowed by the shadows within. Eleanor stood alone on the drive, the weight of her charitable act suddenly feeling heavier than ever. She had brought the strange, silent young man home, but as she watched the doorway where he had vanished, she was struck by the unsettling sensation that it was not she who had brought him, but the house itself that had drawn him in, recognizing a kindred spirit in its own isolated, decaying gloom. Briarwood did not merely occupy its land, it was a creature of it, an organic growth as much as the cypress trees that rose from the black water at its back. Up close, the decay was more pronounced, more intimate. The gray clapboards were not just faded but blistered and warped by a century of sun and saline damp. The brick pillars supporting the house were streaked with white efflorescence and cloaked in a fur of emerald moss. The wide piazza, which should have been a place for taking air and socializing, felt instead like a cavernous, lonely promenade, its floorboards groaning a protest under every footstep. From its railings, one looked out not upon manicured lawns, but upon a wild tangle of overgrown camellias and azaleas, beyond which lay the true master of the domain, the swamp. It was a vast, brooding presence, a living entity that breathed its humid, fecund breath upon the house day and night. The air was perpetually thick with the scent of magnolia, jasmine, and the underlying rot of decaying vegetation from the marsh. At dawn and dusk, a low-lying mist would coil up from the black water, fingering its way through the tree trunks until the line between solid ground and murky bog was utterly erased, and Briarwood seemed to float, a ghost ship on a sea of vapor. The sounds were a constant, layered symphony of life and death, the drone of insects, the splash of a water moccasin slipping from a log, the guttural bellow of an alligator from some hidden slough, the chorus of frogs that rose to a deafening crescendo after a rain. Eleanor led Casper, or rather, he followed at a silent, measured distance, through the main hall of the house. The interior was a study in faded grandeur. The furniture was heavy, dark, and old, the mahogany and walnut surfaces gleaming dully in the dim light that filtered through the shuttered windows. Portraits of long-dead Whitneys, men with stern, imperious faces and women with placid, lace-collared gazes, stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the strange, pale newcomer. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of beeswax, old books, and a faint, persistent mustiness that no amount of cleaning could ever quite eradicate. She showed him the formal parlor, a room frozen in time, its velvet drapes drawn against the sun to protect the fragile silk of the upholstery. She indicated the dining room with its long, polished table capable of seating 20, though it had not seen a full gathering since Arthur's death. And finally she led him up the grand, sweeping staircase, its balustrade smooth under the hand from generations of use, to the upper floor. "This will be your domain," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the hushed stillness of the hallway. "You will keep the main floor clean, attend to the fires in season, serve at meals, and answer the door. You will not be required to labor in the fields. The sun is unkind to you, I imagine." She paused, studying his profile as he looked down the long, dark corridor, lined with closed doors to unused bedrooms. He gave no indication that he had heard her. "Your room is here," she said, turning and ascending a much narrower, steeper set of stairs that led to the attic. The space under the eaves was hot and close, thick with the smell of raw timber and warm dust. Sunlight sliced through the cracks in the wooden shutters of a single round window, illuminating motes dancing in the heavy air. The room was small but not ungenerous for a servant's quarters. It contained a simple rope bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped porcelain pitcher and bowl, a single wooden chair, and a small, battered chest of drawers. It was Spartan, but it was clean and private. "You will be undisturbed here," Eleanor said, a note of pride entering her voice. It was, she believed, a significant kindness. "Malma Bess will bring you your meals. Your duties will begin tomorrow." She waited, hoping for some word, some sign of appreciation for the sanctuary she was providing. But Casper simply walked to the small round window, unlatched the shutter, and pushed it open. A shaft of late afternoon light fell across his face, causing him to flinch almost imperceptibly, his pink eyes narrowing against the glare. He looked out, not at the overgrown gardens below, but beyond, to the endless, brooding expanse of the cypress swamp. The view from this height was vast and intimidating. It was a landscape of stunning, primeval beauty and implicit peril, a tangled kingdom of water and wood where nature ruled with an indifferent, brutal claw. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, his pale hands resting on the windowsill. He seemed drawn to the wildness, as if he found in that chaotic, untamable vista a reflection of his own spirit. In that moment, Eleanor felt a sudden, chilling understanding. She had brought him to Briarwood to civilize him, to tame him within the ordered, if decaying, structure of her world. But she saw now that she might have instead unleashed him into an environment that spoke to the wild, untamed core of his being. The house was a cage, yes, but the view from his window was of a freedom so vast and dangerous it was intoxicating. "Rest now," she said, her voice losing some of its confidence. She turned and descended the narrow stairs, leaving him alone in the hot, quiet attic. As her footsteps receded, Casper remained at the window, a solitary, alabaster sentinel. The sounds of the swamp washed over him, the buzz, the croak, the splash, the sigh of the wind in the Spanish moss. It was a language he understood far better than the clipped, polite tones of his new owner. He was in her house, but he was not of it. He was of this. He was of the wild. And as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of blood and violet, the first, faint whisper of a plan began to form in the deep, silent places of his mind. Briarwood was not a refuge. It was a fortress, and every fortress had its weaknesses. He had only to find them. The following morning, the new routine of Briarwood began, a rhythm as artificial and fragile as the silence that enveloped its inhabitants. Eleanor, determined to establish the normalcy of the situation, descended for breakfast at her usual hour. The dining room, vast and echoing, seemed to swallow the small sounds of her presence. She was seated at the head of the long mahogany table when the door to the serving pantry opened and Casper entered. Malma Bess had outfitted him in the livery of a house servant, a coat and trousers of dark, serviceable wool, a white linen shirt, and a simple cravat. The stark, formal black of the fabric made his alabaster skin and milk-white hair appear even more startling, more spectral. He moved with a quiet, unnerving grace, his feet making no sound on the polished floorboards. In his hands, he carried a silver tray bearing a pot of coffee, a cup, and a small bowl of sliced fruit. Eleanor watched him approach, a complex knot of emotions tightening in her chest. There was a perverse sense of accomplishment in seeing him thus, attired and performing the duties she had ordained. It was a validation of her order, her control. Yet, the sight was also deeply unsettling. The clothes, meant to signify his place in the household hierarchy, instead seemed like a costume on him, a disguise that could not conceal the feral intelligence in his rose-colored eyes. He was playing a part, but she had the disquieting sense that he was studying the play itself, learning its lines and its weaknesses, rather than submitting to his role. He set the tray before her with a precision that was neither servile nor resentful. It was merely efficient. His movements were economical, devoid of any wasted motion. He did not meet her gaze, his attention fixed on the task at hand. "Thank you, Casper," Eleanor said, her voice sounding overly loud in the quiet room. He gave no indication that he had heard. He simply bowed his head a fraction of an inch, a gesture so minimal it could have been a mere shift of balance, and retreated to stand against the far wall, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze directed at nothing. He became a piece of the room's furniture, a pale, silent sentinel. This was to be the pattern of their days. Casper performed every task assigned to him with a cold, flawless competence. He dusted the portraits of the stern-faced Whitneys, his expression unreadable as their painted eyes followed his movements. He laid fires in the grates with a meticulous attention to the arrangement of kindling and log, though the spring humidity made them largely unnecessary. He answered the door, a rare occurrence at isolated Briarwood, with the same impassive silence, unnerving the occasional peddler or neighbor who came to call. Eleanor continued her campaign of gentle benevolence. She ensured he was fed the same food as the household, a marked contrast to the rough rations of the field hands. She had Malma Bess provide him with a salve for the old scars on his back, though he never used it. She spoke to him not with the brusque commands one might use with a field hand, but in soft, complete sentences, as if conversing with a distant, perhaps simple-minded relative. "It looks like rain today, Casper. Best ensure the library windows are latched. I am reading from Mr. Dickens' latest novel this evening. You may listen if your duties are complete. The gardenias are blooming by the piazza. Their scent is quite lovely in the evening, do you not think?" Her words were met with the same impregnable wall of silence. It was a silence that began to wear on her nerves, a constant, low-grade humiliation. Her kindness was a seed thrown onto stone, and it yielded no harvest. She found herself watching him more and more, studying the sharp lines of his face for any crack, any flicker of emotion. She began to invent reasons to be in the same room, to assign him tasks that required his presence near her, just to have that strange, unsettling energy in her vicinity. She told herself it was concern for his spiritual well-being, a Christian's duty to reach a lost soul. But in the quiet, honest moments alone in her room, she admitted it was more than that. His silence was a riddle, and she was obsessed with solving it. His very existence, a man who was both property and person, both brute and something unervingly intelligent, challenged the foundations of her world. To break his silence would be to prove the righteousness of that world, to affirm that her form of kindness was indeed a superior force that could tame even the wildest of creatures. But Casper was not being tamed. He was observing. From his post against the wall, from his attic window, from the shadows of the hall, he was learning the rhythms of the house, the patterns of its mistress. He noted the way Joseph, the driver, dozed in the carriage house after his midday meal. He observed the precise time Malma Bess took her daily walk to the kitchen garden. He saw the heavy iron strongbox in Eleanor's bedroom, and the small, brass key she wore on a ribbon around her neck, tucked into the bosom of her dress. He watched the sun track across the floors, learning which boards creaked and which were silent. He was a student of Briarwood, and his education was not in servitude, but in the architecture of his captivity. The life of gentle servitude was a cage, but he was methodically examining every bar, every lock, every hidden weakness, waiting for the moment when the door might swing open. The silence of the albino man, whom the household now called Casper, was not a mere absence of sound. It was a presence, a tangible entity that filled the rooms of Briarwood, thickening the air and distorting the passage of time. It was a silence that had weight and texture, as dense and impenetrable as the cypress groves that surrounded the estate. For Eleanor, this silence became the central fact of her existence, a constant, gnawing preoccupation that overshadowed even her own loneliness. She had tried kindness. She had tried patience. She had provided comforts far beyond what any slave on the plantation, or indeed in the whole parish, could expect. Yet the wall stood. It was not the sullen silence of a punished child, nor the broken silence of a spirit crushed by hardship. This was different. This was a deliberate, chosen silence, a fortress of the self into which he had retreated and barred the gates. When she spoke to him, his eyes would sometimes flicker towards her, and in that fleeting glance, she perceived not a lack of understanding, but a profound understanding, and a rejection of everything she represented. Her frustration began to curdle into a sense of personal injury. Did he not see the singular position he occupied? Did he not appreciate the risk she had taken, the whispers she had endured, to bring him into her home? Her charity, once offered with a sense of noble purpose, now felt like a debt owed, and his silence was a blatant refusal to pay. She found herself devising new tests, subtle traps designed to provoke a reaction, any reaction. She would deliberately drop a book, a small, silver thimble, watching to see if he would startle at the sudden noise. He did not. His composure was infuriatingly perfect. She would assign him pointless, finicky tasks, sorting a box of rusted keys by size, polishing the same piece of silver over and over, hoping to uncover a spark of resentment in his eyes. But he performed these chores with the same detached, mechanical efficiency as he did all others. One afternoon, as he was dusting the shelves in the library, she positioned herself nearby, pretending to read. "It is a peculiar thing, silence," she mused aloud, her eyes on the page but her attention entirely on him. "Some believe it to be a sign of wisdom. The Quakers, I am told, worship in silence. Others see it as a void, an emptiness waiting to be filled. I wonder, Casper, what your silence signifies." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic whisper of his cloth moving over the leather-bound books. He did not pause, did not hesitate. It was as if she had spoken in a language he did not comprehend, or perhaps in a language so simplistic it was beneath his response. A more chilling thought began to take root in her mind. What if he was not merely refusing to speak? What if, in some fundamental way, he held her in such profound contempt that she was not even worthy of his anger? That her attempts at kindness were so patronizing, so embedded in the system of his oppression, that they inspired only a cold, dismissive scorn? This notion was a deeper insult than any shouted curse. It undermined the very foundation of her identity as a good, compassionate woman. She took to watching him from unexpected vantage points, from the top of the stairs, through a partially open door, hoping to catch him unawares, to see some unguarded expression cross his face. But he was never unguarded. Even alone, his movements were deliberate, his face a mask of calm neutrality. The only time she saw a flicker of anything else was when he looked out a window towards the swamp. Then, for a fleeting instant, his gaze would sharpen, and a faint, almost hungry expression would touch his features, as if he were a caged animal staring at the forest from which it had been taken. The wall was not just around him, it was between them, and it was growing thicker by the day. Eleanor's initial pity had transformed into a frustrated obsession, and his silence was the whetstone against which her patience was being sharpened to a dangerous edge. She had wanted to save a soul, but she was beginning to realize she had locked herself in a room with a sphinx that refused to ask its riddle, leaving her to question everything she thought she knew about charity, power, and the human heart. The quiet of Briarwood was no longer peaceful. It was the tense, breathless quiet of a stalemate, and she was losing the battle without a single word being exchanged. The world of Briarwood was not confined to the main house and its 2 solitary inhabitants. Beyond the peeling columns of the piazza, down a worn path through the live oaks, lay the cluster of rough-hewn cabins that housed the plantation's other enslaved people. This was a world unto itself, governed by its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, and its own deep, abiding fears. And into this world, the news of the white slave in the big house had fallen like a stone into a still pond, sending out ripples of unease that touched everyone. The field hands, their bodies weary from dawn till dusk in the swampy, mosquito-infested rice fields, viewed the situation with a mixture of suspicion and grim irony. To them, labor in the big house was a coveted position, a step away from the back-breaking toil under the overseer's lash. Yet this was different. The mistress had not chosen a strong young woman to be a maid, or a skilled man to be a butler. She had brought home a ghost, a haint, a boy with the color of death on him. Old Solomon, who had seen more than 60 summers and winters on the Whitney land, summed up the general feeling when he muttered to the others after their evening meal of cornmeal and fatback, "Ain't natural. That one got the mark on him. The swamp done spit him out, and the mistress, she done taken him in. Bad luck follows that kind. You mark my words." In their cosmology, shaped by a blend of fractured Christianity and older, African beliefs carried in the memories of their grandparents, albinism was not a mere quirk of nature. It was a sign. Some whispered he was a dag, a ghost, or a spirit, walking in a half-formed body. Others said he was a night walker, a being who had made a pact with dark forces for his pale skin, and that his red eyes could curse a man or steal his soul. They kept their distance, crossing their fingers or spitting on the ground when he passed by on some errand for the mistress. They did not hate him, they feared him, and in the brutal calculus of their lives, fear was a more potent and dangerous emotion than hatred. Malma Bess, the cook, held a more nuanced, but no less troubled view. From her kitchen, the true heart of the plantation's social world, she heard all the whispers. She was a pragmatic woman, her faith a sturdy, simple Christianity that offered solace in a life of servitude. She did not believe in haints, but she believed in the devil, and she believed in trouble. She had seen the way the new boy moved, with a panther's quiet grace, and the way his strange eyes missed nothing. This was not a broken spirit, this was a coiled spring. And she had seen the look in her mistress's eyes, that peculiar, possessive glow that had nothing to do with Christian charity and everything to do with a child who has found a strange new pet. One evening, as Casper brought a stack of firewood into the kitchen, Bess finally addressed him directly. The other house servants, a young girl named Lily and an older, lame man called Isaiah, found sudden reasons to be elsewhere. "Boy," Bess said, her voice low, not unkind but firm. She stirred a large pot of simmering stew over the hearth. "They talkin' 'bout you in the quarters." Casper set the wood down in the box by the fireplace with his customary silent efficiency. He did not look at her, but he did not immediately leave, which she took as a sign to continue. "They say you got the mark. They say you bring bad luck." She paused, letting the words hang in the steam-filled air. "I ain't sayin' I believe such foolishness. But I knows trouble when I sees it. And you boy, you is trouble. For myself, and for dis whole house." For the first time, he turned his head and looked at her. His rose-colored eyes in the firelight were unsettling, but they held no malice towards her. Instead, she saw a deep, ancient weariness and a chilling clarity. "The missus," Bess continued, lowering her voice further, "she thinks she be good to you. She thinks she sev on you. But a chain is a chain, boy, whether it's made of iron or fine words and pretty clothes. You remember that?" A long, silent moment passed between them. It was the first time anyone on the plantation had spoken to him not as a master to a slave, or as a superstitious person to a specter, but as one human being, trapped in the same brutal system, to another. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not agreement, nor was it gratitude. It was simply acknowledgement. He had heard her. Then he turned and left the kitchen, melting back into the shadows of the main house. Bess watched him go, her heart heavy. She had hoped to reach some human core within him, to offer a warning, perhaps even a sliver of kinship. But all she had found was that impenetrable wall, now with a new, unsettling dimension. He understood everything. He understood the mistress's misguided benevolence, he understood the other slave's fear, and he understood the unyielding nature of his bondage. His silence was not ignorance, it was a weapon, and the sharpening stone was the entirety of Briarwood itself. The whispers in the quarters were not just superstition, she realized. They were a premonition. They could feel the storm gathering around the pale, silent boy, and they knew that when it broke, it would not only sweep him away, but everyone in its path. The humid Carolina spring deepened, draping Briarwood in a blanket of oppressive heat and vibrant, almost violent, greenery. The wisteria on the piazza bloomed in great, pendulous purple clusters, their scent so heavy it felt like a physical presence in the air. Inside the house, another kind of growth was taking root, one far more insidious and personal. Eleanor Whitney's initial well-intentioned pity had mutated, fed by the constant, gnawing silence of the young man she owned, into a full-blown obsession. It began subtly. She found herself arranging her day around his movements. She would linger in the library if she knew he was due to dust there, feigning absorption in a book while her entire consciousness was focused on the silent figure moving through the room. She took note of the times he would ascend to his attic room, and she would sometimes stand at the foot of the narrow stairs, listening to the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of his presence above, wondering what he did in his solitude. Did he look out the window? Did he sleep? Did he, in the privacy of his room, ever make a sound? Her conversations with him, always one-sided, became more frequent and more intimate in their tone, as if she were trying to weave him into the fabric of her life through sheer force of will. "I remember my husband, Arthur, used to pace this very room when a shipment was delayed from Charleston," she would say, watching Casper as he straightened a pile of books on the desk. "He had such a temper when it came to business. Not like you. You are so very composed." She studied him as one might study a complex and difficult text, searching for a key to his cipher. She noted the way a muscle in his jaw would sometimes twitch when she spoke for too long, a tiny crack in his armor that she catalogued and revisited in her mind. She saw how his pale, long-fingered hands, which could be so deft and gentle when handling the fragile porcelain of her teacup, could also clench almost imperceptibly when the overseer's voice drifted up from the fields, shouting at the hands. This observation sparked a new theory. Perhaps his silence was not directed at her personally, but was a general response to the world of white people, a world of loud commands and casual cruelty. This idea allowed her to recast herself not as part of the problem, but as its sole solution. She was the exception. She was the one who could, through persistent kindness, prove to him that not all who held the whip, or the deed to his person, were monsters. Her obsession began to bleed into her own solitude. In the evenings, sitting alone in the formal parlor with only the portraits of dead Whitneys for company, her thoughts would circle back to him. She imagined scenarios of his gratitude. She pictured him, one day, finally breaking his silence to thank her for her compassion. She envisioned him becoming her devoted protector, a silent, loyal guardian in this lonely house. In these fantasies, he was less a man and more of a symbol, a testament to her own goodness, a living, breathing project that would justify her idle, mournful existence. She began to neglect other aspects of the plantation's management. The overseer, a grim man named Dobbs, would come to the house with reports and questions, and she would dismiss him with a distracted wave, her attention captured by the sight of Casper trimming the wicks of the oil lamps in the hall. She stopped receiving the few visitors who made the long journey to Briarwood, finding their chatter tedious and their presence an intrusion upon the intense, silent drama unfolding within her home. Malma Bess watched this transformation with a growing sense of dread. She saw the way her mistress's eyes followed the albino boy, the proprietary light in them. It was the same look the master had sometimes gotten when he coveted a particularly fine horse or a piece of land. It was the gaze of possession, but twisted into something more intimate, more desperate. "Miss Eleanor," Bess ventured one morning as she served breakfast, "that new boy, he seemed mighty quiet. You think maybe he's simple?" It was a delicate probe, an attempt to introduce a note of caution. Eleanor's response was swift and sharp. "He is not simple, Bess. He is intelligent. I see it in his eyes. He has been deeply wronged, and his silence is a testament to his suffering. We must be patient." The was telling. Bess was being enlisted in Eleanor's campaign, her own decades of wisdom and experience dismissed in favor of her mistress's romanticized narrative. Bess said nothing more, but the worry etched itself deeper into the lines of her face. She recognized the danger of a master who saw a slave not as a tool, nor as a brute, but as a reflection of their own soul. It created a bond far more unstable and volatile than simple hatred. The mistress was building a castle in the air, and she was building it on the back of a silent, seething volcano. Eleanor's growing obsession was not drawing her closer to understanding Casper. It was blinding her to the reality of the man standing before her, a man whose silence was not a void to be filled with her own fantasies, but a deep, still pool hiding currents of rage and a will to freedom that would soon demand a violent outlet. The turning of the season from spring's lush bloom to the heavier, more somber green of early summer seemed to intensify Eleanor's fixation. The air in the house grew thick and still, and the silence emanating from Casper felt less like a passive state and more like a held breath, a waiting. Determined to force a crack in his composure, to elicit some spark of human response, Eleanor decided upon a new strategy. She would appeal not to his body, which she had already clothed and fed, but to his soul, which she was convinced lay trapped behind his pale, unreadable eyes. She would give him a gift, not of comfort, but of enlightenment. She spent a long afternoon in the library, a room that smelled of leather bindings and the faint, sweet decay of aging paper. The portraits of her forebears looked down from the walls as she ran her fingers along the spines of the books. Her choice had to be perfect. A novel was too frivolous. A scientific text was too cold. It must be something that spoke to the core of human morality, to redemption and grace. Her hand finally settled on a small, leather-bound volume, its cover worn soft with use. It was a book of Psalms, one that had belonged to her as a girl. Inside the front cover, in her own youthful, looping script, was written, "To Eleanor, may these words be a lamp unto thy feet." It was, to her mind, the ultimate gift. She was offering him not just words, but the Word. She was offering him the key to his own salvation, and in doing so, she was implicitly offering him a shared language, a common ground upon which they could finally meet. She imagined him, in the solitude of his attic room, slowly sounding out the verses, their divine truth slowly thawing the ice in his heart. She pictured the light of understanding dawning in those strange pink eyes, and the first, halting words of gratitude directed not at her charity, but at her spiritual guidance. That evening, After a dinner taken in the usual heavy silence, she summoned him to the parlor. The room was lit by a single oil lamp, casting a soft golden glow that pooled on the tables and left the corners in deep shadow. She stood before the cold fireplace, the small book held in her hands. "Casper," she began, her voice imbued with a solemn tenderness. "I have been considering your situation. A man's spirit requires nourishment as surely as his body. I wish to give you this." She extended the book of Psalms towards him. "It is the word of God. It offers comfort to the afflicted and hope to the lost. I believe there is great solace to be found within these pages. I should like you to have it." He stood before her, his face, as always, a mask of impassivity. His eyes dropped from her face to the small, dark book in her outstretched hands. For a long, suspended moment he did not move. Eleanor's heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the moment. This was the breach in the wall. Slowly he reached out. His fingers, pale and slender, did not tremble as they closed around the book. He took it from her, his touch careful, almost reverent. But the reverence, she sensed with a sudden, cold clarity, was not for the gift, nor for the giver. It was the careful reverence one might afford a venomous snake or a fragile, yet potentially dangerous, artifact. He did not open it. He did not look at the inscription. He simply held it, his gaze lowering to the cover as if he could see straight through the leather to the words within. There was no smile, no nod of thanks, no sign of the spiritual awakening she had so vividly imagined. There was only that same, unnerving stillness. "You may read it in your room," she prompted, her voice faltering slightly. "If there are words you do not understand, I could help you." He lifted his eyes to hers then, and in their rose-colored depths, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was not gratitude. It was not even the expected hatred. It was a look of profound, almost pitying, understanding. It was as if he saw straight through her gesture, past the Christian charity and the well-meaning intention, to the very core of its arrogant presumption. He saw her need to save him, to own not just his body but his soul, to remake him in the image of her own faith and morality. And in that one, piercing look, he refused her. Without a word, he gave a short, sharp bow of his head, a gesture of dismissal as much as acknowledgement, turned, and left the room, the book held tightly in his hand. Eleanor stood alone in the lamplight, the emptiness of the room pressing in on her. The gift had been given and accepted, yet she felt a more profound rejection than ever before. He had taken the Bible not as a key, but as another link in the chain that bound him. She had offered him a lamp for his feet, and he had accepted it without a word, leaving her standing in a darkness that felt deeper and more personal than any she had known before. The wall was still there, but now she understood its true nature. It was not a wall of ignorance or sullenness. It was a wall of judgment, and she had just been found wanting. The failure of the gift festered within Eleanor like a hidden wound. The silent rejection of the Psalms felt more personal, more damning, than his previous indifference. It was a spiritual rebuke that left her feeling exposed and foolish. Her obsession, now sharpened by humiliation, demanded answers. She could no longer be content with simply observing the Sphinx. She needed to know its history, to understand the origins of the stone from which it was carved. Her thoughts turned to the one person at Briarwood who possessed a deep well of knowledge and a network of whispers that connected all the plantations along the river, Malma Bess. She found the cook in the kitchen house, a separate, low building behind the main house where the heat from the great hearth was a tangible force even in the summer. Bess was rolling out dough for biscuits, her strong, capable arms dusted with flour. The air was rich with the smell of baking bread and simmering hem hocks. "Bess," Eleanor began, trying to sound casual as she settled onto a stool near the work table. "I am concerned about Casper." Bess did not look up from her work, but her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes'm." His silence, "It is not natural. I have tried everything. Kindness, patience, even giving him the Lord's word." Eleanor's voice betrayed a hint of desperation. "He remains a closed book. You hear things, Bess. The people in the quarters, the other house servants, did anyone know him from before? From Georgetown?" Bess paused her rolling, her hands resting on the pin. She kept her eyes fixed on the dough. "Don't know as it's my place to say, Miss Eleanor." "Please, Bess," Eleanor insisted, her tone softening into a plea. "I only wish to understand him. To help him. How can I reach his soul if I do not know what has been done to it?" This appeal to Christian duty, a language Bess understood, finally swayed her. The old cook sighed, a sound of weary resignation. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the table, her gaze distant, looking into the flickering flames of the hearth as if seeing the past reflected there. "He come from the Alder place," she began, her voice low. "Up near Winyaw Bay. Was a mean place, they say. The master there, he had a taste for the women in the quarters." She glanced at Eleanor, who flushed but nodded for her to continue. "Casper's mama, her name was Soraya. She was a proud woman from what I heard. A Igbo woman. When the boy was born white as a grub, with eyes like a rabbit, it caused a stir." Bess's voice dropped even further, as if the story itself was a dangerous thing to speak aloud. "Master Alder, he wouldn't even look at him. Said he was a devil's child, a punishment from God. But Soraya, she loved that boy. In her own way. She saw his color not as the master's shame, but as her own. A mark of her sin. She believed God had cursed her boy for her transgression." Eleanor listened, rapt, her own frustrations momentarily forgotten in the face of this genuine tragedy. "The other slaves," Bess continued, "they was scared of him. Wouldn't let their children play with him. Called him ghost and haint. The master sold off Soraya not long after, to a trader heading south. Couldn't bear the sight of her, I suppose. The boy, he was left. Just a little thing. No mama. No one to care for him. He grew up in the barn, like an animal. Got beat for just being seen. That scar on his jaw, that was from the overseer's ring when he was 12, for looking at him the wrong way." The story unfolded with a grim, relentless logic. A childhood of unparalleled isolation, of being feared and reviled by black and white alike. He was not a person, he was a symbol of a master's sin, a mother's shame, and a community's superstition. He had learned that to be seen was to be punished, and to speak was to invite violence. His silence was not a choice, it was a survival mechanism honed over a lifetime. "And the name?" "Ghost," Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Bess nodded grimly. "That was the name they gave him. The only name he ever knew, for you give him that new one." Eleanor sat back, the pieces clicking into a terrible, heartbreaking picture. Her Casper was a name imposed upon him, just as his livery was, just as his presence in her house was. She had believed she was offering him a fresh start, but she had merely transplanted the ghost into a new cage, one gilded with kindness but a cage nonetheless. Her attempts to save him must have felt like a grotesque parody of all the rejection that had defined his life. She thanked Bess and walked back to the main house in a daze. The late afternoon sun, filtering through the moss-draped oaks, seemed to illuminate a new and terrifying truth. She had been trying to conquer a fortress, only to discover that the fortress was a prison, and the prisoner had been so profoundly broken by his captivity that he no longer knew how to leave, even if the doors were thrown open. But a new, more chilling thought followed this wave of pity. What if he wasn't broken? What if, within that prison, he had forged a will of iron, and his silence was not the silence of a victim, but the focused, patient silence of a predator waiting for its moment to strike? The story of his past had not provided the answer she sought. It had only revealed the terrifying depth of the mystery she had brought into her home. Armed with the harrowing history of the boy she called Casper, Eleanor Whitney felt a renewed and even more fervent sense of purpose. The knowledge of his suffering did not, as it might have for a more perceptive soul, inspire caution or a re-evaluation of her own role. Instead, it solidified her conviction. She was not like Master Alder. She was not like the overseer with the signet ring. She was his savior, the one good white person in a lifetime of tormentors. His past suffering became the dark canvas upon which she would paint her masterpiece of redemption. She looked at him now with a sense of tragic ownership. Every scar was a testament to the world's cruelty, every moment of his silence, a cry for the deliverance that only she could provide. She began to see his resistance not as a personal rejection, but as a symptom of his deep, psychological wounds. He did not trust her because he had been taught that trust was a prelude to betrayal. He did not speak because his voice had always been met with violence. This analysis, while containing grains of truth, was ultimately a form of profound narcissism. She was centering herself in his trauma, casting herself as the heroic figure in his narrative of pain. Her behavior became more cloying, more suffocating. She now interpreted his every action through the lens of his tragic past. When he flinched from a sudden movement, she saw not a man conditioned by brutality, but a fragile soul she must protect. When he stared out at the swamp with that hungry look, she saw not a yearning for freedom, but a melancholy she must soothe with her presence. "You need not be afraid here, Casper," she would say, her voice dripping with a saccharine compassion that was more oppressive than any command. "What happened to you before, that is in the past. Briarwood is a sanctuary. I am your sanctuary." She began to share her own sorrows with him, as if offering her vulnerabilities as a currency to purchase his. She spoke of Arthur's long illness, of the crushing loneliness of widowhood, of the weight of managing the decaying plantation. "We are both of us alone in this world, in our own ways," she mused one afternoon as he lit the candles in the drawing room before dusk. "We have both known loss. Perhaps that is why God saw fit to bring us together." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the statement hung in the air, unnoticed by her. She was equating her grief, the grief of a wealthy, privileged widow, with the lifelong, systematic dehumanization of a man who had been treated as less than an animal. She was building a bridge of shared suffering, failing to see that she stood on one solid, gilded bank, while he was stranded on the other, in a quagmire of misery she could not possibly fathom. This new phase of her obsession did not bring them closer. It widened the chasm. Her pity was a mirror, but it was a distorted one. In it she saw only a reflection of her own goodness, her own capacity for love. She failed to see the reflection she presented to him. A woman, yet another master, who sought to own his pain just as she owned his body. Her sanctuary was a prison of empathy, and her kindness was a chain that chafed far more than iron ever could because it demanded his gratitude, his emotional surrender. He watched her during these monologues, his pink eyes seeming to absorb her words without reflection. He saw the performative nature of her grief, the way she used her own sadness as a tool to pry him open. He understood that her version of saving him required him to remain broken, so that she could forever be the healer. To become whole, to assert his own will, would be to destroy the fantasy she was building. Her love was conditional upon his perpetual victimhood. A terrible symmetry began to emerge. Just as Master Alder had seen him as a symbol of his own sin, Eleanor Whitney saw him as a symbol of her own virtue. He had been objectified by hatred, and now he was being objectified by a love that was just as possessive, just as blind to his true self. The only difference was the decoration on the cage. One evening, she brought him a small, framed miniature from her own collection, a painting of a serene-looking lamb. "I saw this and thought of you," she said, her voice soft. "A lamb, innocent and silent, led to the slaughter. But you have been spared. You are safe now." He took the miniature, his fingers brushing against the cool glass. For a moment, Eleanor's heart leapt. This was it. A connection. But as he looked at the image of the docile, doomed creature, a faint, almost imperceptible sneer touched his lips. It was there and gone in an instant, but she saw it. It was not the look of a lamb. It was the look of a wolf being offered a bouquet of flowers. He placed the miniature carefully on a shelf, turned, and left the room without a word. Eleanor stood staring at the little painted lamb. The twisted reflection had shattered for a moment, and she had glimpsed the reality beneath, not a broken victim, but a proud, furious man who saw her salvation for the insult it was. The knowledge chilled her to the bone, but even then she could not let it go. The obsession had taken root too deep. She had to prove him wrong. She had to make him see the goodness in her, even if it destroyed them both. The stage was being set for a final, catastrophic confrontation, born not of hatred, but of a kindness that had curdled into the most dangerous form of blindness. The oppressive heat of a Carolina summer settled upon Briarwood like a sodden blanket, wilting the gardens and drawing the thick, sweet scent of magnolia blossoms to a near-overpowering intensity. Inside the house, the air was still and heavy, the silence between its mistress and her servants stretched to a breaking point. Eleanor's obsession, fed by the story of his past and fortified by her own unwavering self-regard, had reached its zenith. She decided upon a grand gesture, a culminating act of benevolence so profound, so personal, that it would surely shatter the final barriers around his heart. The date she chose was her own birthday. She made no mention of the occasion to him throughout the day, allowing the anticipation to build within her own breast. She instructed Mama Bess to prepare a special supper, not the usual solitary meal, but a small feast with roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, and a jam cake, a rare and expensive treat. As evening drew in, she dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of dove-gray silk, a subtle departure from her morning blacks, and fastened a single pearl brooch at her throat. When the hour came, she did not have him serve her in the vast dining room. Instead, she had the small table in the morning room laid for two. The sight of it, with its two place settings gleaming in the lamplight, sent a thrill of nervous excitement through her. This was unprecedented, a breach of protocol so radical she felt dizzy with her own magnanimity. She summoned him. He entered the room, his dark livery a stark contrast to the soft, warm light. His eyes took in the scene, the two chairs, the two plates, the covered dishes, without a flicker of surprise. This, in itself, was disconcerting. "Casper," she began, her voice slightly tremulous. "Today is my birthday, and I have decided that there is no one with whom I would rather mark the occasion than you." She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Please, sit. You will dine with me tonight." It was the ultimate gift she could conceive. She was offering him, a slave, the semblance of equality. She was erasing for one evening the line between master and servant, inviting him to share not just her food, but her company, her personal milestone. She waited for the stunned gratitude, the dawning awe. He did not move. He stood just inside the doorway, his posture as rigid as ever, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Sit down, Casper," she repeated, a note of strained patience entering her tone. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the table. But he did not take the offered chair. Instead, he went through the motions of his usual duty. He lifted the cover from the platter of chicken, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. He picked up the serving fork and spoon. "No," Eleanor said, her voice sharpening. "That is not what this is. You are not to serve. You are to sit and eat with me." His hand stilled. He placed the utensils back on the platter with a soft, precise click. He then looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze was direct, unflinching, and utterly devoid of the gratitude she so desperately sought. It was a look of cold, clear comprehension, and of utter, final rejection. He understood her gesture perfectly. He saw it for what it was, not an offer of friendship, but the ultimate act of possession. She was not elevating him, she was playing a game, forcing him to participate in a charade of equality that she could revoke at any moment. To sit at that table would be to accept her terms, to validate her fantasy that a shared meal could erase the fundamental truth of their relationship, that she owned him. It would be the deepest betrayal of himself, a performance more degrading than any manual labor. He took a single step back from the table, his silence now screaming with defiance. A hot flush of humiliation spread across Eleanor's cheeks. This was worse than the rejection of the Bible. This was a public, albeit silent, spurning of her most intimate offering. All her carefully constructed compassion evaporated, burned away by the fury of wounded pride. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you refuse me? After all I have done for you. I saved you from that auction block. I brought you into my home. I have clothed you, fed you, treated you with a kindness no other in your wretched life has ever shown you. And this is how you repay me? With this stubborn, ungrateful silence." She was on her feet now, her hands gripping the back of her chair. The carefully arranged birthday tableau seemed to mock her. The gray silk gown felt like a fool's costume. I have tried to be patient. I have tried to be kind. But you are determined to be a brute, aren't you? You are determined to see a monster in me, because it is the only narrative your twisted mind can comprehend. Very well. If it is a brute you see, then a brute you shall have. She was shouting now, her voice echoing in the small room. All the frustration, the obsession, the months of silent rejection came pouring out in a torrent of vitriol. Get out. Get out of my sight. Go back to your attic, you ghost. You are not a man, you are a thing. And you will never be anything more. Casper did not flinch. He did not cower. He absorbed her outburst with the same impassivity with which he had absorbed her kindness. He gave one last long look around the room, at the two place settings, the uneaten food, the furious, weeping woman, and then he turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. Eleanor collapsed into her chair, sobbing with rage and self-pity. The birthday had failed. The grand gesture had exploded in her face. But as she sat there amidst the ruins of her feast, a cold, hard certainty settled in her soul. The battle was now declared. It was no longer about saving him. It was about breaking him. She had offered the carrot, and it had been rejected. Now she would find the stick. The fragile illusion of benevolent charity had shattered, revealing the raw, ugly power dynamic that had underpinned it all along. The wall was higher than ever, and now, it was fortified with her hatred. In the days that followed the catastrophic birthday dinner, a new and frigid formality descended upon Briarwood. The pretense of kindness was gone, stripped away like a rotten veneer, leaving behind the bare, unpalatable truth of the master-slave dynamic. Eleanor's commands, once delivered in soft, hopeful tones, were now clipped and impersonal. The weight of her disappointment had curdled into a cold, simmering resentment. She no longer tried to decipher the enigma of Casper. She merely required his obedience, and his continued, flawless silence was a daily reminder of her failure to secure anything more. Casper, for his part, seemed to embrace this new, honest arrangement. The tension that had once thrummed in the air when Eleanor was near seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a kind of grim equilibrium. He was a machine of servitude, his movements more precise than ever, his detachment absolute. But beneath the surface of this cold peace, his mind, sharpened by a lifetime of observation and survival, was more active than ever. The shattered illusion of the birthday dinner had been a revelation. It had confirmed his deepest belief that all kindness from a master was merely a different flavor of control, and that his only path to true autonomy lay not in earning favor, but in seizing opportunity. It was during this period that his attention, once diffused across the entire strange theater of Briarwood, began to focus with laser-like intensity on one particular object, the strongbox. It was a heavy, iron-banded chest, about 2 feet in length, that sat on the floor of Eleanor's bedroom, partially concealed by the frilled linen of her bed skirt. He had seen it many times while cleaning, a dark, squat presence in the corner. But now he studied it. The lock was a substantial piece of brass, formidable and unyielding. The key was never in it. His eyes, during his duties, began to trace the path of that key. He noted that Eleanor wore it constantly, day and night, on a simple silk ribbon around her neck. It was tucked into the bosom of her dress, a secret against her skin, a tangible symbol of all that was withheld, all that was locked away. The contents of that box became the subject of his silent deduction. It was not difficult to surmise. The plantation's accounts, what profits there were from the dwindling rice fields, would be kept there. But more importantly, there would be her personal wealth. The Whitney family jewelry. The silver. The tangible, portable currency of a life of privilege. He had seen the few pieces she still wore, the pearl brooch, a simple gold band, and knew that the more valuable heirlooms were stored away, safe from the damp and the prying eyes of servants. The strongbox represented more than just money. It was the heart of Eleanor's security and her power. It was her independence, her legacy, her buffer against the world. To possess it would be to unravel the very fabric of her existence. And for him, it represented the only conceivable means of escape. With its contents, he could vanish. Not into the swamp, to live like an animal, but onto a ship, to the north, or even to Europe, where his strange appearance might be remarked upon, but where the brand of slavery would not automatically define him. It was a fantasy of such audacity it was almost dizzying, but it was the only fantasy that offered a future beyond the four walls of Briarwood or the next plantation he might be sold to. He began to plan with the patience of a geologist observing the imperceptible shift of continents. He noted the times Eleanor was most likely to be out of her room, her daily walk on the piazza, her long, solitary baths, her occasional, brief visits to the family cemetery plot. He observed the patterns of the other servants. Malma Bess never entered the mistress's bedroom unsummoned. The young maid, Lily, was terrified of the room, whispering that it was haunted by the ghost of Master Arthur. His own access was regular, predictable. He cleaned in there every morning. The routine was his camouflage. He would dust the furniture, sweep the floor, and his eyes would take in every detail: the weight of the box when he moved it to sweep beneath, the exact construction of the lock, the way the light from the window fell across the floor at that hour. He was mapping the territory of his potential crime. The key, however, remained the insurmountable obstacle. It lay against the skin of his owner, a constant, tantalizing, and utterly unattainable prize. He could not simply take it. Any such attempt would lead to immediate discovery and certain, brutal punishment. He needed a moment of chaos, a lapse in her vigilance, a circumstance where the ribbon around her neck might be loosened, and the key might, for a fleeting second, become accessible. He did not know when or how such an opportunity would arise. He only knew that he must be ready. The locked strongbox ceased to be a piece of furniture and became an altar upon which he offered his silent, focused hatred. It was the focal point of all his hopes and all his rage. The Cold War of wills had entered a new, more dangerous phase. Eleanor believed the battle was over, that she had re-established the natural order. She did not realize that her servant had simply shifted his strategy, and that the prize he now sought was not her approval, but the very foundation of her life. The silence in the house was no longer just the sound of his resistance. It was the quiet before the storm. The change began not in the sky, but in the air itself. The heavy, humid stillness of the past week grew even more profound, becoming a palpable, suffocating weight. The birds, usually a constant chorus in the swamps, fell silent. The leaves on the massive live oaks hung limp and motionless, as if holding their breath. By midday, the sky, which had been a hazy, brassy blue, began to take on a sickly, greenish-yellow cast. The atmosphere felt charged, electric, as if the world were a great glass bell about to crack. Malma Bess, her face grim, came to Eleanor in the library. "Miss Eleanor," she said, her voice low with urgency. "Big storm comin'. A hurricano. The air, it tastes wrong. We needs to batten down." Eleanor, pulled from her brooding, felt a thrill of fear that was almost a relief, a distraction from the oppressive emotional stalemate in her own house. She had lived through hurricanes before. They were acts of God that swept away the petty concerns of men, leaving only the stark imperative of survival. "See to it, Bess. Have the men secure the outbuildings. Bring in anything that can fly. And have Joseph see to the horses." The plantation stirred into a frantic, purposeful activity. Field hands were called in from the rice fields. Shutters were closed and barred with heavy wooden planks. The great, slamming sounds echoed through the house like gunshots. Casper worked alongside the others, his pale form a stark contrast to the dark-skinned men, his silence fitting the grim mood of the preparations. He helped carry water, secure furniture on the piazza, and board up the ground floor windows. His efficiency was, as always, unnerving. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to rise. It started as a fitful moaning in the treetops, then grew to a steady, menacing roar. The first fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the shuttered windows like thrown gravel. Soon, it was a deafening, horizontal deluge. The house, a fortress just moments before, now felt terrifyingly fragile, groaning and shuddering under the storm's assault. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof shingles and ripping limbs from the ancient oaks with sounds like cracking bones. Darkness fell, but it was not the peaceful dark of night. It was a chaotic, roaring blackness, punctuated by the frantic flicker of lightning that lit up the cracks in the shutters, revealing the terrified faces of the household slaves who had gathered in the main hall for safety. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs, her knuckles white as she gripped the balustrade. The sheer, mindless power of the storm was humbling. It made a mockery of her authority, her social position, her carefully maintained world. It was in this atmosphere of primal fear that her eyes found Casper. He was not huddled with the others. He stood apart, near the front door, listening to the fury outside. And in a moment of lightning-lit clarity, she saw not fear in his face, but something else, a fierce, almost exultant recognition. The chaos outside seemed to resonate with the chaos she now knew simmered within him. The storm was not his enemy, it was his ally, a great, roaring beast that was tearing apart the ordered world that held him captive. A particularly violent gust shook the house, and a sound like a cannon shot echoed from above, a tree limb, or perhaps part of the roof, giving way. A collective scream went up from the huddled servants. Eleanor, her heart hammering against her ribs, felt a terror more personal than her fear of the storm. In this maelstrom, all rules were suspended. The lines of power were blurred. The pale, silent figure by the door suddenly seemed less like a servant and more like a dangerous, unpredictable force of nature himself. Driven by a sudden, desperate need for protection, for the illusion of control, she made a decision that would prove to be her undoing. "Casper," she called out, her voice barely audible above the din. He turned, his pink eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "The house, it may not hold. You will remain in the room adjacent to mine tonight. I may have need of you." It was a command, but it was born of utter vulnerability. She was inviting the wolf to guard the sheepfold. She was placing her safety in the hands of the one person in the house she understood the least and feared the most. She was creating the very opportunity he had been waiting for. For a long moment he simply looked at her, the storm screaming its accompaniment. Then he gave that same, slight, infuriating bow of his head. He did not speak, but his acceptance was a palpable thing in the charged air. He would be near her. He would be inside her final sanctuary. The storm had provided the chaos. Eleanor, in her fear, had provided the opportunity. As the hurricane reached its terrifying crescendo outside, a different kind of storm, long brewing in the silent spaces between them, was finally about to break within the shuddering walls of Briarwood. The heart of the hurricane was a realm of pure, shrieking madness. The world outside the shuttered windows ceased to exist, replaced by an unending, deafening roar that felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure threatening to crush the house and everyone in it. Between blasts of wind, the rain hammered against the clapboards with the force of 1,000 frantic fists. The very foundations of Briarwood trembled, and the air inside was thick with the smell of fear, damp wool, and the ozone tang of the lightning that flashed incessantly, casting the interior in stark, stuttering moments of blue-white light. Eleanor had retreated to her bedroom, the most fortified room in the house. But its solidity felt like an illusion. Each groan of timber, each crash from outside, made her flinch. She had dismissed the other servants to the relative safety of the central hallway downstairs, but she had kept her word. Casper was in the small, adjoining dressing room, separated from her only by a single, locked door. A door whose key she had nervously turned, then thought better of it, leaving it in the lock. The mere knowledge of his presence, so close in the violent dark, was a torment. Was he a guardian or a predator? The storm had obliterated the certainty of everything. She could not sleep. She sat upright in her bed, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, a single candle guttering on the nightstand, its flame dancing wildly with every gust that found a crack in the defenses. Her ears strained, trying to separate the sounds of the storm from any sound within the house. She heard nothing from the dressing room. His silence was now more terrifying than any noise. It was the silence of a creature waiting. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. It seemed to be holding its breath at a peak of fury. Then, a new sound joined the cacophony, a splintering crack, followed by a heavy thud on the roof directly above her room. A section of the ceiling near the window bulged inward, and a torrent of rainwater began to pour through, splashing onto the floorboards. Eleanor cried out, scrambling back from the deluge. The candle was extinguished, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the periodic lightning flashes that illuminated the terrifying scene of her sanctuary being violated by the elements. Panic seized her. This was no longer an abstract fear. Her room was flooding, the roof was failing. She needed help. The person closest was the one she feared. "Casper!" she screamed, her voice shrill against the storm's roar. "Casper, the roof!" Almost instantly, the door to the dressing room opened. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, not as a startled servant, but as a figure of eerie calm amidst the chaos. A flash of lightning revealed his face. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the damp, his pale skin seemed to glow in the gloom, and his pink eyes were wide, reflecting the storm's fury, but his expression was one of intense, focused clarity. He took in the situation at a glance: the weeping ceiling, the growing pool of water on the floor, the terrified woman on the bed. He moved with a purpose that was both efficient and dispassionate. He grabbed a large porcelain washbasin and placed it under the worst of the leak, the drumming of the water into the bowl a counter-rhythm to the storm's madness. Then he began dragging the heavier pieces of furniture, a chaise lounge, a heavy armchair, away from the spreading water. Eleanor watched him, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a bewildered sense of reliance. He was here. He was helping. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps, in this moment of shared crisis, the human connection she had craved would finally be forged. But as he worked, his gaze swept the room, and in a lightning flash, it locked onto the strongbox, now sitting in a shallow puddle of water. He paused for a fraction of a second, his entire body stilling. Then his eyes moved to her, to the neck of her nightdress, where the silk ribbon holding the key lay damp against her skin. The moment hung suspended in the storm-lit darkness. The pretense of the dutiful servant fell away. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the cold, hard assessment. He was not just seeing a leaking roof and a frightened mistress. He was seeing an opportunity, delivered by the hand of God himself. Before she could speak, before she could even form a coherent thought, he took a step towards her. It was not the respectful step of a servant approaching his owner. It was the deliberate, closing step of a hunter. "The key," he said. His voice. It was the first word he had ever spoken to her directly, and it was not a request. It was a low, rasping command, stripped of all pretense, all submission. It was the voice of the ghost, finally given sound, and it was more terrifying than the hurricane's scream. Eleanor stared, her mind refusing to comprehend. "It. The key," he repeated, his voice flat and hard, his hand outstretched. "To the box. Now." The storm, the leaking roof, the danger, it all fell away. There was only this. The moment she had both feared and, in some deep, unacknowledged part of herself, known was inevitable. The silent war was over. The battle had begun. The single word, key, hung in the storm-ravaged air, a sound more shattering than any thunderclap. For a paralyzing moment, Eleanor could only stare at the pale, outstretched hand, the rose-colored eyes burning with a cold fire in the intermittent lightning. The illusion she had nurtured for months, of the misunderstood soul, the project of redemption, shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. This was not her sullen, damaged Casper. This was the ghost the auctioneer had warned her about, fully manifested, his silence broken only to make a demand that laid bare the brutal truth of their relationship. A violent tremor racked her body, part terror, part incandescent rage. "How dare you?" she whispered, the words a ragged tear in the roaring silence between storm gusts. "After all I have done for you, you would rob me?" His face showed no emotion, no anger to match her own. His expression was one of chilling patience, as if he were dealing with a slow-witted child. "You have done for me?" he rasped, the unfamiliar voice rough from disuse, yet laced with a venomous clarity. "You bought me. You dressed me in your clothes. You fed me from your table. You gave me a name that was not mine and a book of prayers for a life I cannot have. You have done nothing for me. You have done it all to feed your own vanity, to paint yourself as a saint in this rotting house." Each word was a lash, stripping away the layers of her self-deception. He saw her. He had always seen her. And he despised her. "You are no different from the others," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming more intense, more personal. "You are worse. They used the whip and called it discipline. You use kindness and call it salvation. But it is still a chain. You wanted to own my gratitude. You wanted to own my soul. But you do not own this." He tapped a long, pale finger against his own temple, the gesture stark and defiant in a flash of lightning. "This you never had." The truth of his words was a physical blow. Her charity, her patience, her gifts, he had not seen them as benevolence, but as a deeper, more insidious form of control. And he had rejected it all. The humiliation of the birthday dinner, the failure of the Bible, every silent rebuff, it all coalesced into a white-hot core of fury. "You ungrateful wretch!" she shrieked, scrambling off the bed and standing to face him, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I saved you from that block. I gave you a home. I treated you like a human being." "Like a pet," he snarled back, the first crack in his icy composure, a flash of the feral anger he had kept locked away. "A curious, white pet to distract you from your emptiness. You never saw a man. You saw a reflection of your own imagined goodness. You are a hollow woman in a hollow house, and your kindness is a poison." He took another step forward, his hands still outstretched. "Forgive. I will not ask again." "No," she screamed, her fear finally overriding her rage. She backed away, her hands flying to the ribbon at her neck, clutching the small, hard shape of the key through the damp silk. "I will see you hanged for this. I will call for Joseph. For the overseer." A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. "Call them," he challenged, his voice a low threat. "In this storm? They will not hear you. And if they do, what will they find? A slave, defending himself from his mistress? Or a mistress who invited her slave into her bedchamber during a hurricane? Who will they believe?" The devastating logic of his words froze the blood in her veins. He had thought of everything. The storm was his accomplice, and her own poor judgment had provided the perfect stage for his mutiny. The social order she had always relied upon was useless here, in the dark, in the roaring chaos. There were no witnesses, no rules. There was only power, and in this moment he held more of it than she did. She was trapped. Truly, utterly trapped. The water still poured through the ceiling, the storm still screamed its fury, but the real tempest was here, in this room, with this man who was no longer a servant but her judge and executioner. The breaking point had not been his, it had been hers. Her world, her sense of self, her very safety, had broken into irreparable shards. And from the wreckage, the ghost stared back at her, waiting to claim what was his. The space between them in the storm-lashed room was no longer empty air. It was a battlefield, charged with the aftermath of their shattered illusions. Eleanor's scream had died in her throat, choked off by the terrifying certainty in his eyes. He was right. In this isolated, roaring darkness, her title, her wealth, her whiteness, none of it could save her. The fundamental power dynamic had been inverted. He was no longer pleading or demanding. He was stating a new and terrible reality. The grim smile faded from his lips, replaced by an expression of cold finality. He closed the distance between them in two swift, silent strides. Eleanor stumbled backward, her legs hitting the edge of the bed, and she fell onto the mattress with a gasp. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a primal fear she had never known. This was not the controlled violence of an overseer's lash. This was something personal, intimate, and infinitely more terrifying. "You speak of hanging," he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper that cut through the storm's din. "But what is my life? A thing you bought for $200. A shadow's existence, subject to your whim. You speak of gratitude. For what? For the privilege of serving you? For the honor of being your well-dressed animal?" He leaned over her, his pale face hovering like a moon in the darkness. You showed me kindness, and in doing so, you showed me the deepest insult of all. You believed your soft words could erase the auction block. You believed a full belly could make me forget my mother was sold away from me. You believed a book of Psalms could make me kneel and thank God for my chains. His hand darted out, not towards her throat, but towards the silk ribbon. Eleanor cried out, clawing at his wrist, but his strength was immense, born of a life of hard labor and hardened by hatred. The delicate silk tore with a faint, pathetic sound. He held the key, its small brass form gleaming in a flash of lightning. It was a trivial object, yet its transfer felt more violent than any blow. This, he said, holding the key up between them, is the only truth. Not your God. Not your charity. This. He closed his fist around it. Power. A strange calm settled over Eleanor then, the calm of absolute despair. The fight drained out of her. She lay on the bed, staring up at the monstrous figure she had created, not through cruelty, but through a blindness so profound it was itself a form of violence. I only wanted to help you, she breathed, the words a hollow, meaningless echo. You wanted to help yourself, he corrected, his voice devoid of all emotion now. The rage had been spent, leaving only a chilling purpose. You were lonely. You were bored. You needed a project to make you feel righteous. I was that project. And now the project is complete. He turned his back on her, a gesture of such profound contempt it was worse than any physical threat. He walked to the strongbox, knelt, and with a single, smooth turn of the key, opened the lock. The click was deafening in a momentary lull of the wind. Eleanor watched, numb, as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, she knew, was everything that was left of the Whitney legacy. Her late husband's gold watch. A pouch of Spanish doubloons. Her mother's emerald necklace and diamond earbobs. The deeds to the property. The paper currency from the Bank of Charleston. The tangible proof of a life of privilege, now being rifled through by the pale, silent hands of the man she had believed she owned. He worked quickly, efficiently. He ignored the papers, the deeds, things that had no value to him. He took the jewelry, the coins, the banknotes, stuffing them into a small leather bag he produced from within his coat. He was prepared. He had been waiting for this. The betrayal was not in the theft. The betrayal had happened long ago, in the very moment she had believed her kindness could transcend the fundamental obscenity of owning another human being. The money and jewels were just the final, physical manifestation of that deeper, more profound betrayal. She had betrayed his humanity by refusing to see it, and he was now betraying her trust, a trust she had never truly earned, but had simply assumed as her right. He stood up, the bag now heavy with her past and his future. He looked at her one last time, his features unreadable in the gloom. You asked me to speak, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Now I have. Remember my words. They are the only gift I will ever give you. Then he turned, unlocked her bedroom door, and stepped out into the storm-ravaged hallway, leaving her alone in the dark, with the empty strongbox, the pouring rain, and the devastating echo of the truth. The act of betrayal was complete. He had taken not just her wealth, but the very foundation of her world, and in doing so, had finally, irrevocably, claimed his freedom. The closing of the bedroom door behind him was not a sound, but a full stop. It marked the end of one reality and the terrifying beginning of another. For a long moment, Eleanor lay paralyzed on the damp bed, the storm's fury a distant roar compared to the tempest of shock and violation raging within her. The torn ribbon around her neck felt like a brand. The open strongbox was a gaping mouth of loss. But it was the memory of his words, the cold, precise dismantling of her every motive, that truly eviscerated her. Then, a primal instinct, older than pity, older than pride, surged through the numbness. Survival. He could not be allowed to leave. If he escaped with that bag, her life was over. Not just her comfort, but her very standing. She would be the laughingstock of the county, the widow who was duped and robbed by her own freakish slave. The humiliation would be a living death. And worse, he would be free. The thought was an intolerable violation of the natural order. That silent, pale thing, walking away with the Whitney jewels in his pocket, It was unthinkable. A raw, guttural sound tore from her throat. She scrambled off the bed, her limbs clumsy with adrenaline and fear. She had to stop him. She had to raise the alarm. The overseer, Dobbs, he had a pistol. He would hunt him down like the animal he was. She flung open her bedroom door and stumbled into the dark hallway. The house was a cacophony of groaning timber and the drumming rain, but she could hear his receding footsteps on the main staircase. He was not running. He was walking with that same infuriating, deliberate calm. "Casper!" she shrieked, her voice raw and shrill. She rushed to the top of the stairs, clutching the banister. He was halfway down, a pale ghost in the darkness. He paused and turned to look up at her. In the faint, storm-lit gloom, his expression was not one of fear, but of a weary, final resolve. "Stop! Thief!" she screamed, the words echoing in the vast hall. "Joseph! Someone! He's robbing me!" But her cries were swallowed by the hurricane's scream. No one came. The household was huddled in terrified silence, or simply could not hear. Driven by a madness born of utter desperation, Eleanor gathered her sodden nightdress and rushed down the stairs after him. "You will not. I will not let you." She reached the bottom landing as he was unbarring the heavy front door. A gust of wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the wall, and the full force of the storm exploded into the house, a whirlwind of rain and leaves and terrifying sound. He turned to face her, the leather bag clutched in one hand, his body braced in the doorway. "Stay back," he warned, his voice low but cutting through the chaos. "Do not follow me." "You belong to me," she screamed, launching herself at him, her fingers clawed, aiming for his face, for the bag. "You are my property. Mine." He caught her wrists with an effortless, brutal strength, his grip like iron. For a moment, they were locked in a grotesque tableau at the threshold of the house, the civilized world at her back, the wild, storm-ravaged freedom before him. "I am no one's property," he growled, his face inches from hers, his pink eyes blazing with a light she had never seen before, a pure, unadulterated fury. "Not anymore." He shoved her back, a powerful thrust that sent her stumbling across the slick floor of the hallway. Her head connected with the sharp, carved leg of a hall table with a sickening crack. White-hot pain exploded behind her eyes, and the world swam in a dizzying vortex of darkness and lightning. She lay on the floor, dazed, fighting to stay conscious. Through a blurry haze, she saw him standing over her, his chest heaving. He was not looking at the door anymore. He was looking down at her. And in his eyes, she saw the final, terrible calculation. She was a witness. She could identify him. She was the last chain. He took a step towards her. A cold, absolute certainty filled her. This was not about the money anymore. This was about silence. "No," she whimpered, trying to push herself backward, her limbs refusing to obey. "Please." He did not speak again. There was no rage left in his face, only a grim, horrifying necessity. He knelt beside her. His hands, those same hands that had so delicately handled her china and her books, found her throat. The struggle was brief. Her weakened flailing was no match for his determined strength. The last thing Eleanor Whitney saw was the pale, impassive face of the man she had named Casper, his white hair plastered to his forehead by the rain blowing in through the open door. The last thing she heard was not the storm, but the terrible, guttural sound of her own breath being choked off. The last thing she felt was not the hands around her neck, but the final, shattering knowledge that her charity had not saved a soul. It had forged a murderer. And then, there was nothing but the storm and the profound, eternal silence she had so desperately tried to fill. The moment Eleanor's body went limp beneath his hands, a profound and eerie silence seemed to descend upon Casper, a stillness at the very eye of the hurricane's rage. He released his grip, his fingers stiff and cold. He did not look at her face, at the staring, accusing eyes or the slackened jaw. That person, the mistress of Briarwood, was gone. What remained was merely an obstacle that had been removed, a problem solved with brutal finality. There was no horror, no remorse, only a cold, vacuum-like emptiness where such emotions might have resided in another man. A lifetime of being treated as less than human had, in its final, logical extreme, hollowed him out, allowing him to commit this ultimate act without the burden of a conscience that society had never acknowledged he possessed. He stood, his movements returning to that same, unervingly precise efficiency. The leather bag, heavy with gold and jewels, was secure. His first task was complete. The second was escape. He stepped over her body, his boots leaving wet prints on the polished floor. The storm still shrieked through the open doorway, but it was a path to freedom now, not just a meteorological phenomenon. He moved through the main hall, a ghost in the house he was leaving behind. He did not head for the front door, which was too exposed. Instead, he turned towards the back of the house, to the service entrance that led to the kitchen yard. His plan, refined over weeks of silent observation, was meticulous. He went first to the kitchen, its hearth now cold and dark. From a hook by the door, he took Joseph's spare oilskin coat, a heavy, waterproof garment meant for just such weather. He shrugged into it, the coarse fabric a stark contrast to the fine wool of his livery. In a cupboard, he found a knapsack containing the food he had been secretly pilfering and storing for days. Hardtack, a wedge of cheese, strips of dried venison. He added this to his bag of plunder. His next stop was the small room off the pantry where tools were kept. He selected a heavy, wicked-looking hatchet, its blade gleaming dully in a flash of lightning. It was not for violence, but for survival, to build shelter, to clear a path, to defend himself against the natural dangers of the swamp. He tucked it securely into his belt. Thus equipped, he was no longer Casper, the house servant. He was a fugitive, armed and provisioned. He left the kitchen and slipped out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind and rain was physical, a wall of water that stole his breath. The world was a chaos of whipping branches, flying debris, and a roar that felt like it would crush his skull. He pulled the oilskin tight and began to run, not towards the road, which would be the first place they would look, but straight for the tree line at the back of the property, towards the vast, trackless expanse of the cypress swamp. The theft was more than the bag of valuables. It was a theft of time, of a head start. He knew the storm was his greatest ally. It would conceal his flight, wash away his tracks, and delay the discovery of the body and the crime. By the time the weather cleared and the household found their mistress strangled on the floor and the strongbox empty, he would be deep in the swamp, a place where no white man and few black men would dare to follow. He reached the edge of the woods, a tangled wall of vegetation being thrashed by the wind. Without a backward glance at the dark, groaning silhouette of Briarwood, he plunged into the darkness. The murky water, swollen by the rain, rose to his knees, then his waist. The hatchet was in his hand now, chopping at vines and branches that blocked his path. The swamp was a living, breathing entity, and it tried to reject him, to swallow him, but he fought it with a fierce, desperate energy. He was stealing everything. Her life, her wealth, her security. But most of all, he was stealing back the one thing that had been taken from him the moment he was born into bondage: his future. Every labored step through the sucking mud, every sting of the lashing rain, every terrifying cry from the unseen creatures of the night was a step towards a horizon that was his alone to define. The theft was complete, paid for with the currency of a dead woman's broken neck and his own extinguished humanity. He vanished into the heart of the storm, leaving behind only the ghost of a name and the echoing silence of a terrible, final transaction. The swamp, in the absolute darkness and screaming chaos of the hurricane, was a descent into a primordial hell. The familiar landmarks Casper had observed from his attic window were obliterated, transformed into a shifting, treacherous labyrinth of water and wind-whipped vegetation. The towering cypress trees, their knees protruding from the black water like the gnarled fingers of drowned giants, groaned and swayed alarmingly. Spanish moss, usually hanging in still, gray curtains, became spectral whips lashing through the air. The water, already tea-colored and opaque, was now a churning soup of mud, torn leaves, and broken branches. Casper moved with an instinctual grace that belied the terror of the environment. The hatchet was an extension of his arm, its rhythmic thwack against a obstructing vine or a low-hanging limb a counterpoint to the storm's mindless roar. The oilskin coat repelled the worst of the rain, but water poured down his neck and soaked his trousers, the heavy wool of his stolen livery becoming a sodden, chilling weight. The knapsack and the bag of plunder were secured tightly against his body, their precious weight a constant, grounding reminder of his purpose. He did not try to fight the floodwaters. He used them. He allowed the current of the swollen creeks to carry him, swimming across deeper channels with powerful economical strokes, his pale head a fleeting beacon in the Stygian water. He was a creature of this world now, his senses heightened to an animalistic sharpness. He could smell the difference between stagnant water and a flowing channel. He could feel the subtle shift underfoot from firm ground to sucking, bottomless muck. His eyes, sensitive to light, were perfectly adapted to the near-total blackness, picking out the silvery sheen of water on bark and the deeper black of navigable gaps in the vegetation. His mind was a map of cold, hard facts. He knew the sun rose in the east. He knew the river lay to the south, and beyond it, the Atlantic. He knew the main roads and plantations were to the north and west. His path, therefore, was a relentless push south and east, deeper into the most impenetrable part of the marsh, a place avoided even by the most experienced slave hunters. The dangers were legion. A submerged log became a wading alligator. A tangle of roots concealed a nest of water moccasins, their bodies coiled and agitated by the churning water. Once, a massive limb, torn from a centuries-old oak, crashed into the water mere feet from him, sending a wave that nearly swept him off his feet. The wind ripped shingles from imaginary roofs and sent them spinning like scythes through the air. He did not allow himself to think of the house behind him, of the woman on the floor. Those images were from another life, a discarded skin. To dwell on them was to invite hesitation, and hesitation in this environment was death. His entire being was focused on the next step, the next breath, the next swing of the hatchet. The physical agony was a purgative, burning away the last vestiges of Casper, the house servant. With every yard gained, the ghost solidified, a spectral figure born of water, wind, and wrath. After what felt like an eternity, the fury of the storm began to wane. The wind dropped from a scream to a mournful howl, then to a steady, blustering gale. The rain lessened from a solid wall of water to a heavy, persistent downpour. The sky lightened from utter blackness to a deep, bruised gray. Dawn was approaching. Exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest, Casper found a spot of relative safety, a small hummock of high ground beneath the sprawling, sheltering roots of a massive cypress. The ground was damp but solid. He shrugged off the knapsack and the heavy bag of treasure, his body feeling unnaturally light without their burden. He secured the oilskin in the branches to form a crude lean-to, then huddled beneath it, his back against the great tree's trunk. He allowed himself to rest, but not to sleep. His eyes remained open, scanning the gray, watery world around him. The swamp was slowly revealing itself in the grim dawn light, a vast, flooded forest of incredible, desolate beauty. The air was clean and cold, scoured by the storm, smelling of wet earth and decay. In the distance, he heard the first, tentative calls of birds. He was free. The word echoed in his mind, not with joy, but with a staggering, terrifying weight. He was alone. He was hunted. He was responsible for his own life for the first time. There was no mistress to provide food, no roof to shelter under, no predictable rhythm of duties. There was only the swamp, his wits, and the bloody price of his liberty. He opened the knapsack and ate the piece of hardtack, chewing mechanically. He then, with careful, deliberate movements, opened the leather bag. The contents gleamed dully in the weak light. The gold watch, the emeralds, the doubloons, they were cold, inert things. They represented a power he had stolen, but they could not buy him food here, or safety, or a moment's peace. Their value was conditional, existing only in the world he had just fled. He repacked the bag, his expression unchanged. It was a tool, nothing more. A means to an end once he reached that end. As the new day solidified around him, Casper the slave was gone, erased as completely as his footprints in the flooded swamp. What remained was a fugitive, a murderer, a man utterly untethered from the world of men, disappearing into the immense, silent, and waiting wilderness. The storm had been his accomplice, and now, the swamp was his sanctuary and his prison. He had vanished, leaving behind no trail, no clue, only the echoing question of his existence and the terrible cost of his flight. The swamp, in the absolute darkness and screaming chaos of the hurricane, was a descent into a primordial hell. The familiar landmarks Casper had observed from his attic window were obliterated, transformed into a shifting, treacherous labyrinth of water and wind-whipped vegetation. The towering cypress trees, their knees protruding from the black water like the gnarled fingers of drowned giants, groaned and swayed alarmingly. Spanish moss, usually hanging in still, gray curtains, became spectral whips lashing through the air. The water, already tea-colored and opaque, was now a churning soup of mud, torn leaves, and broken branches. Casper moved with an instinctual grace that belied the terror of the environment. The hatchet was an extension of his arm, its rhythmic thwack against a obstructing vine or a low-hanging limb a counterpoint to the storm's mindless roar. The oilskin coat repelled the worst of the rain, but water poured down his neck and soaked his trousers, the heavy wool of his stolen livery becoming a sodden, chilling weight. The knapsack and the bag of plunder were secured tightly against his body, their precious weight a constant, grounding reminder of his purpose. He did not try to fight the floodwaters. He used them. He allowed the current of the swollen creeks to carry him, swimming across deeper channels with powerful, economical strokes, his pale head a fleeting beacon in the Stygian water. He was a creature of this world now, his senses heightened to an animalistic sharpness. He could smell the difference between stagnant water and a flowing channel. He could feel the subtle shift underfoot from firm ground to sucking, bottomless muck. His eyes, sensitive to light, were perfectly adapted to the near-total blackness, picking out the silvery sheen of water on bark and the deeper black of navigable gaps in the vegetation. His mind was a map of cold, hard facts. He knew the sun rose in the east. He knew the river lay to the south, and beyond it, the Atlantic. He knew the main roads and plantations were to the north and west. His path, therefore, was a relentless push south and east, deeper into the most impenetrable part of the marsh, a place avoided even by the most experienced slave hunters. The dangers were legion. A submerged log became a wading alligator. A tangle of roots concealed a nest of water moccasins, their bodies coiled and agitated by the churning water. Once, a massive limb, torn from a centuries-old oak, crashed into the water mere feet from him, sending a wave that nearly swept him off his feet. The wind ripped shingles from imaginary roofs and sent them spinning like scythes through the air. He did not allow himself to think of the house behind him, of the woman on the floor. Those images were from another life, a discarded skin. To dwell on them was to invite hesitation, and hesitation in this environment was death. His entire being was focused on the next step, the next breath, the next swing of the hatchet. The physical agony was a purgative, burning away the last vestiges of Casper, the house servant. With every yard gained, the ghost solidified, a spectral figure born of water, wind, and wrath. After what felt like an eternity, the fury of the storm began to wane. The wind dropped from a scream to a mournful howl, then to a steady, blustering gale. The rain lessened from a solid wall of water to a heavy, persistent downpour. The sky lightened from utter blackness to a deep, bruised gray. Dawn was approaching. Exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest, Casper found a spot of relative safety, a small hummock of high ground beneath the sprawling, sheltering roots of a massive cypress. The ground was damp but solid. He shrugged off the knapsack and the heavy bag of treasure, his body feeling unnaturally light without their burden. He secured the oilskin in the branches to form a crude lean-to, then huddled beneath it, his back against the great tree's trunk. He allowed himself to rest, but not to sleep. His eyes remained open, scanning the gray, watery world around him. The swamp was slowly revealing itself in the grim dawn light, a vast, flooded forest of incredible, desolate beauty. The air was clean and cold, scoured by the storm, smelling of wet earth and decay. In the distance, he heard the first, tentative calls of birds. He was free. The word echoed in his mind, not with joy, but with a staggering, terrifying weight. He was alone. He was hunted. He was responsible for his own life for the first time. There was no mistress to provide food, no roof to shelter under, no predictable rhythm of duties. There was only the swamp, his wits, and the bloody price of his liberty. He opened the knapsack and ate the piece of hardtack, chewing mechanically. He then, with careful, deliberate movements, opened the leather bag. The contents gleamed dully in the weak light. The gold watch, the emeralds, the doubloons, they were cold, inert things. They represented a power he had stolen, but they could not buy him food here, or safety, or a moment's peace. Their value was conditional, existing only in the world he had just fled. He repacked the bag, his expression unchanged. It was a tool, nothing more. A means to an end once he reached that end. As the new day solidified around him, Casper the slave was gone, erased as completely as his footprints in the flooded swamp. What remained was a fugitive, a murderer, a man utterly untethered from the world of men, disappearing into the immense, silent, and waiting wilderness. The storm had been his accomplice, and now, the swamp was his sanctuary and his prison. He had vanished, leaving behind no trail, no clue, only the echoing question of his existence and the terrible cost of his flight.